Hi everyone, welcome back. In this episode I'm going to be showing you how we centre clay on the pottery wheel. So the purpose of centering is just to get the clay perfectly smooth, round, even in the centre of the wheel and ready to continue on to the next steps with. So to begin, wheel head clean and dry. The same goes for the piece of clay. All of that is kind of easy enough at this stage with it being the first piece of clay that I'm working with, but when you're working with piece after piece, it will be important to make sure there's no liquid between a fresh piece of clay going down onto the wheel head, because if there is any moisture here or here, this is just going to slide around and fly off. So clean and dry, clay firmly down, as central as you can get it. So most wheel heads will have a series of concentric rings on them, which you can use to identify where the middle is. So the more in the middle this piece of clay is, the more easy getting it centred is going to be. And then a few pats just to make sure it's properly stuck in place. I find it's generally worth giving it a bit of a wobble like this. So here I'm trying quite hard to kind of pull that off centre, and it's really staying quite well put. The first mistake that people often make when they're throwing is they pop the clay down gently like this, and then as soon as they try and do anything with it, it just comes straight off in their hands because it wasn't affixed to the wheel head as thoroughly as it wants to be. So that's where a few pats like so will make sure it's properly stuck in place. So to get the clay centred, I'm going to get the wheel going nice and fast. You want the wheel going fast enough that it's kind of a blur, but not so fast that the clay is kind of just flinging itself outwards off the wheel the whole time. So something around this kind of speed tends to work well. I'm getting plenty of water on both my hands and on the clay. So throughout the whole throwing process, the last thing you want is any drag between your hands and the clay, particularly during this first stage of centering, because we're applying pretty much our whole hands to the clay at once and applying a fair bit of pressure to the clay. Everything will dry out quite quickly, so every few seconds it'll be important just to gently take those hands off, and another palmful of water or two, like so, will tend to be enough to keep things going for a few more seconds. So posture when centering, I've got my elbows tucked firmly into my sides. My forearms are either resting on my legs or on the edge of the splash pan here. So we want everything as firmly anchored as we can get it. I'm leaning forwards over the clay, so we're really using our whole upper body as one kind of unified, anchored force against the clay. If you're kind of leaning back with your arms waving out in front of you like this, it's going to be much more difficult to keep everything under control. So just really bearing down on the clay like so will be the first thing you can do to make this easier. The way that I get the clay centred is I start with my hands like two walls either side of the clay like so. So I'm focusing on where this bottom edge of my hand here is on the wheel. So you're going to feel the clay make your hands wobble around. So the first thing you're going to want to do is just focus on that bottom edge of your hand and try not to let the clay make it wobble around from side to side, because it's that wobbliness that we're trying to kind of squeeze out of the clay effectively. So hands like two walls either side, my fingers are wrapping around the far side, and my thumbs are together flat over the top like so, and they're just going to be pushing down into the clay. So I'm going to be squeezing the clay in three directions at once, essentially. So breaking those down into the three separate stages. My palms are squeezing towards each other, so quite forcefully squeezing towards the middle of the wheel. My fingers on the far side of the clay from me are squeezing in towards myself. So as you can see, by doing both of those, but without doing anything with my thumbs, the sides are getting under control, but the top is getting really wobbly and uneven. So whilst we're applying that inwards pressure from the sides, our thumbs are pushing quite firmly down into the clay. And it's the combination of these three directions So palms together, fingers towards and thumbs down into it, that we kind of force the clay into the centre of the wheel until it looks something like this. So you can tell when the clay is centred when, even though the wheel is spinning, there's no visible movement or wobbliness to the clay. So by contrast, if there's any kind of wobbliness at all like this, or if when you go to rest your hands on the clay, there's any visible movement to your hands, or it doesn't quite feel even underneath your hands, that's a good sign that the clay isn't quite centred, and it just needs a bit more time spent on it and a bit more pressure kind of working into it until it's where it wants to be. So getting the clay centred can be quite a frustrating thing to learn. It will take a lot of time, but unfortunately it is necessary to stick with it and make sure that the clay is properly centred before you move on to the next steps, because if the clay isn't centred, just to again demonstrate, so with a wobbly piece of clay like this, as I then move on to opening the clay up, I don't know if you can see that from where the camera is, but there's a lot more clay on one side of the opening and a lot less clay on the other side of the opening. So as we proceed through the steps of making a pot, this unevenness is just going to get more and more pronounced until eventually you're going to have a piece that's just really not cooperating, and things are sooner or later going to go wrong. So ensuring that it's properly centred to start with is really important. One of the common pitfalls when it comes to centering is if the clay isn't thoroughly kneaded and prepared to begin with. So if there are any air bubbles stuck in the clay, or if there's any unevenness in terms of the consistency of the clay, that's also going to make it much more difficult to get centred, and you can get to the point where it feels like it's centred on the outside, but then as you go to open it up, because there's a sort of slightly firmer part and a slightly softer part, as you open it up, it kind of comes off centre and starts wobbling around and misbehaving. So a lot of the time, if you're just having a really bad day and for some reason the clay just won't centre, there's a good chance it goes back to the kneading and the preparation of the clay. Another way to centre the clay that people often use is by what's called coning up and down. So this works particularly well if there is any unevenness in the clay. What I'm going to do is squeeze it up tall and thin and then push back down into it. And by distorting the clay in that way, you cycle the clay through itself, and that's a good way of working out any air bubbles and working out any unevenness. So to do that, I'm just squeezing it firmly kind of between my palms and my fingers, like so. So at this stage, my thumbs, as you can see, aren't doing anything to the clay. It's just a firm squeeze inwards to make a sort of tall column like so. And then using sort of the heel of my thumb and this bottom edge of my palm here, I'm going to enclose the whole piece and just push down and away from myself into the clay. Back to that ice hockey puck sort of shape. So by repeating this a few times, just squeezing it up, like so, and then pushing it back down into itself, you will eventually get the clay where it wants to be, nice and smooth and even, and as centred as it needs to be. Something that can be helpful if your posture allows it is just kind of tucking your right elbow here into your hip and using this heel of your right hand as a very firm kind of wall that the clay comes in against. So just using that there like so, and then by pushing flat down into the top with your left hand, So the heel of your right hand here is centering the outside, and this bottom edge of your left hand here is getting the top under control. So between those two motions, again, that can be quite an effective way of getting the clay centered. So that's 3 different techniques for getting the clay centered. As with all things clay, as I've said before, it really is just about the practice and the time spent doing it. If you are starting to get frustrated, or if you're starting to doubt your ability, just remember that persistence is the key. If you do stick at it, it will eventually come. So I hope that's all been useful for you, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.